This is Hannon Russell, your REI roving reporter, and today we're with John Edwards, whose recently released book, Sacking the Citadel, The History, Theory, and Practice of the Greco Sacrifice, has just been released. Thanks for being with us today, John.
It's a pleasure.
Tell us, what is the book about, and how did you happen to get interested in writing it?
Well, it's about, as you said, the Greco sacrifice discovered by Greco in the year 1620. What was more remarkable than his discovery was the fact that he wrote it down. What I decided to do for a variety of reasons was to take a look at the original sacrifice, provide a classification of all of the possibilities, and to look at the theory and the history of the sacrifice through time, what other people have written about it, and 308, as it turns out, annotated games that really examine the sacrifice in all of its intimate detail.
For those who may not know, what is the Greco sacrifice?
Fairly simple and straightforward in most cases, although there's some interesting exceptions. There's a bishop's sacrifice on h7. King is almost forced to take it, or black will simply lose a pawn. It could be on h2 for white. It follows with a knight move, a knight check on g5, followed by a queen move, usually to h5 or to the h-file, with some very interesting complications, because after knight to g5, the king on h7 has 4 and sometimes 5 possibilities. The king can retreat to g8 or h8, or move forward to g6 or h6. The knight can be captured, and there's some other remarkable possibilities that we tracked. I wrote this book for a lot of reasons, but mostly because I've been teaching for 35 years, and I've been looking around for a very meaningful way to explain to students how, in fact, to prepare for these kinds of tactical possibilities. And so what the book wound up doing in this 5th chapter was to take a look at what happens when, in terms of the sacrifice, if there's a slight change in the position, what happens to the complications. And the complications, in fact, are really dependent upon some very small little sub-details. It was a tremendous amount of fun to do this, and pedagogically, in terms of its instruction, very, very, very helpful.
Well, you have over 300 very deeply annotated games. As you went through them, was there a common thread other than the bishop takes h2 or h7 check that ran through them?
Well, a whole range of factors. I think that in the early games, what I attempted to do for the earliest set of games is simply to find every single game that involved the sacrifice. The defense tended not to be very good. Over time, and certainly in the modern games, what's happening is that the defense is extraordinarily more complex, requiring that the attacking side have even more assets at their disposal in order to make the sacrifice work. In 1959, Vladimir Vukovic, a wonderful Estonian writer, put forth the first meaningful theory about the sacrifice. That was that in addition to the bishop that captures on h7 and the knight that comes into g5 and the queen that follows through the h-file, in order for the sacrifice to succeed, at least 2 additional assets, maybe a pawn on e5 or a rook on an open file or a dark squared bishop on c1 are required for the sacrifice to succeed. In the later years, as the defense gets better, more of these additional assets are required, sometimes 3, 4, even 5 additional assets, and so that the tactical lines become a real treat to follow through and watch.
Who are some of the modern-day players who have been the practitioners and maybe also the victims of this sacrifice?
Well, what's extraordinary about the book, I thought, was that almost all of the modern players are involved in one way or another. The obvious exception is Fischer, whose games just didn't lend themselves to the sacrifice. But we see in the modern games, we see all of the world champions, notably Kasparov, who's there not once but 3 times, in 2 of those cases playing against a computer. So imagine, at once he sacrifices against the computer, in another game he accepts the sacrifice against the computer, and these are really extraordinary games to follow. In the early years, all of the strong players are involved, all of them. I think that the one story that sort of runs to the top, in one of the small configurations, when there's a black knight defending on e7, the configuration changes, and the very first player who figured out what to do was a very young player named Boris Spassky, who proceeded very precisely and gave us the pattern for the attack that lives on to the modern day.
One of the real original parts of this book, I thought, was your codification of the elements that are required for a successful sacrifice. In the remaining time that we have, a half minute or so, can you tell us some of the common threads that run through these sacrifices?
Well, as the games become more complex, the king g6 line, which many annotators have suggested is unplayable and simply loses for the defending side, there are tremendous complications and wonderful. What we discovered when we went through this was that the sacrifice is rich and full of variety, and full of lines to explore. And there were even some new lines that had not even been looked at. One of those, in fact, is not just possible king moves back to the 8th rank or up to the 6th, but the possibility in many lines of the queen capturing the knight when it reaches g5 in positions where white is already sacked a piece or has a piece on pre or an exchange sacrifice that's waiting to be captured. The queen winds up getting, the defending side winds up getting the bishop that sacks on h7, the knight, as well as either an additional exchange sack or another piece. That 5th chapter was a labor of love. And in addition to the 308 games, there are a ton of additional games that help to explore all of those lines. There are even 10 games in there in which king to h8, a line that you normally would never go to because it looks like the queen pops into h and mates on h7, even king to h8 can be very playable under some extreme and interesting circumstances.
John Edwards, Sacking the Citadel. It's a virtual treasure trove of both spectacular tactics and instructive annotated games. Thanks for being with us, John.
My pleasure.